1994, Okaloosa County, Florida. A group of inmates uncover a disturbing scene alongside Interstate 10.
One of them discovered a body while they were landscaping, almost fully decomposed.
She was almost entirely skeletonized. She still had some flesh on her. There's a lot of information that you gather from the soft tissue that you wouldn't necessarily have on your skeletal remains.
The zip ties at her throat were really the clue that this was a homicide.
Detectives exhaust every lead trying to identify their Jane Doe. Eventually, they hit a dead end, and her case goes cold.
We did get some leads from other people that were missing. However, those leads were followed and nothing was able to come out of it. We weren't able to identify her.
I think that they were shocked to find someone they couldn't identify.
Almost 30 years later, new forensic science jumpstarts the investigation, giving detectives another chance to identify Jane Doe.
We were very excited as we had wondered since 1994 who this victim was.
I told my colleagues that we're going to identify her before the end of the year.
This is the story of the 30-year search for the identity of a murder victim and the name of the person who murdered her. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Bloodline Detectives. Okaloosa County in northwest Florida, known for stunning beaches along the Emerald Coast.
We have emerald green waters and white sugar beaches on the south end, and then we have farmland in the north end of the county. Okaloosa itself is a Choctawhatchee Indian word for black water because of the color of our rivers in the north end of the county, contrasted with the white sugar beach sand of the banks of the rivers.
It's small, we get a lot of tourists for our beaches.
We live where people vacation, so this is a wonderful place to live and raise your family. There is not a lot of violent crime. I think when we do have violent crime, it's shocking.
I think it's fair to say that the violent crimes are rising, but nothing compared to other cities. And then in 1994, in the 90s, from what I understand, pretty low crime rate.
Much of the Okaloosa area is occupied by swamps, recreational vehicle parks, RV parks. But the main feature of Okaloosa County is Interstate 10, because it's this main road that takes you from the coast of Florida all the way to the west coast in California. It is a major trucking route. Any goods, any vehicles, anything that is transported by a large truck that goes from the west to the east, there's a good chance it will be at some point on Interstate 10.
September 14, 1994, inmates from the Okaloosa Correctional Institute carrying out supervised maintenance on Interstate 10.
The inmates were working a shift along Interstate 10 with a supervisor, and one of them discovered a body while they were landscaping. That inmate ran to his supervisor right away and let the supervisor know what he found. They notified law enforcement right away. Then senior officers with investigations would direct the scene and collection and things like that.
Back then, we had about 7 investigators that worked for the whole county. One of them would come out and be the lead on the investigation.
So they would immediately secure the scene. They would remove everybody from the area. They would tape it off to prevent anybody from being able to come into the area. And then they would do scene sketches, drawings. They would photograph the scene and then contact the medical examiner's office, at which time the coroner would respond and take possession of the body and or the skeletons in this case. and then just finish processing the scene.
They're looking for artifacts, things, clues as to if there was a struggle, was the person alive when they were there, or were they dumped? But the remains themselves were mostly, it's just a skeleton, just bones.
She was almost entirely skeletonized. She still had some flesh on her. She was wrapped up in a puffy jacket.
And there was a little bit of a floral print dress and then a little bit of jewelry.
She had some jewelry in her hair, and she had, kind of costume jewelry and a sterling silver ring on. What was left of her hair was brown with obvious bleaching.
Another really important artifact that they found actually were these zip ties that typically an electrician or a sound engineer or someone would use to wrap cords to keep them organized. They found that, and it was right with the body and right in the neck area of the body.
The zip ties at her throat were really the clue that this was a homicide.
The missing Jane Doe becomes a homicide investigation. Crime scene investigators preserve all evidence found with the victim's remains. They also take samples from the surrounding area. Detectives want to nail down who is this victim and how long has she been there.
They collected insects, foliage. I know that there was a forensic entomology report done to try to determine the time of death based on the degree of decomposition.
They can look and see, oh, well, that insect takes this long to find and colonize and grow in a corpse. And it's like a flag, a marker for them. When they see that particular insect, that bug, in the remains, they then can make a conclusion generally, an educated guess about how long that body has been exposed to the elements and to the insects.
I don't think anyone ever pinpointed an exact time of death because of the state of decomposition. It was very difficult, but they did use forensic entomology and do the best that they could with the state that the body was in. They believed that it had been there no later than April of that year, April of 1994.
The evidence is collected, it's secured, and then we send it here locally to Florida Department of Law Enforcement to get analyzed to see whatever DNA or anything they could get from it.
What they're looking for as well is evidence of identity.
Okaloosa County detectives wait for autopsy results that could reveal information about the ID of their Jane Doe and the ID of her killer. That's next on Bloodline Detectives. September 14, 1994, Okaloosa County, Florida. Skeletal remains of an unidentified person discovered along Interstate 10. Investigators secure every bit of evidence they can for testing. The victim's remains undergo autopsy. Detectives aim to learn more about their Jane Doe.
When we have just skeletonized remains, we've lost all the soft tissue. So if you were bruised, I would never see it or ever know it unless there was an injury to your bones. If you were shot, I'd have to hope it hit some bones, otherwise I'd never be able to tell. There's a lot of information that you gather from the soft tissues that you wouldn't necessarily have on your skeletal remains. The clothing actually kept the skeletal remains mostly intact, but there was some surface scatter of the smaller bones, and the skull, I think, was found about 4 feet away. When they brought her, they brought what they could find. Surprisingly covered quite a bit of her remains. I'd say about 85% of her came back to us. They documented all of her clothing, and since she was an unidentified person, they also documented the tags and the size of the clothing, which can help us determine maybe how old she is and how big she was. we're looking for other pieces of evidence. Again, we wouldn't have any fingernails or places where you could possibly collect for DNA evidence for a sexual assault because they're just skeletonized remains. We would do what we could, and in this case we found 2 ligatures that were encircling her cervical vertebrae that were still left over and intact, that were still held there, actually by her hair. And then we would do x-rays or radiographs, again to see if there's anything there. Following that, we would inventory and document what we do have, note what we don't have in terms of bones, do a dental examination or have that sent to a forensic dentist to determine where she had any dental repairs. Then we would send these remains to a forensic anthropologist to go over every single bone in detail and try to gather as much information as they can from what the bones can tell you. We learned about how tall she was. She was about 5'4", plus or minus 2 inches. And surprisingly, they made a guesstimation of how much she weighed based on her bra size, which was a 34B, which I thought was remarkable. She was about 110 to 114 pounds. There was no perimortem trauma. That means that there was no obvious signs of trauma or injuries to the bones immediately surrounding death. However, we were lucky enough to recover part of the hyoid bone. About 2/3 of it, 1/3 of it was missing. And that could have been because it wasn't fused there, or it could have been because it was fractured, as if she were strangled.
There was a major clue in the autopsy room that would lead to a conclusion of the cause of death. And that would be these black electrical cord ties around the neck. It doesn't take a very experienced detective or even a journalist to conclude probably was a strangulation involved in this.
The autopsy reveals a lot to investigators. Jane Doe's height, her weight, and the suspected COD, cause of death. It's a start, of course, but forensic science is still in its infancy in the 1990s. Detectives and science have a long way to go.
In the mid-90s, they didn't have the tools that are relied on today by the same detectives. Databases were just starting to be created and to be shared. Forensic tools that we depend on today were in their very early stages. Forensic science has come a long way in the last 30 years.
They consulted with multiple agencies and they scoured missing persons reports.
But with a skeletal remains, it's a lot more difficult. You do not have facial ability to be able to recognize them, had no identifiable victim to be able to say this person is missing. We might send out a notification to other agencies in the area and we would tell them internally, hey, we have found a body or remains of a female. Do you have anyone missing?
In fact, when we were reviewing the report, we noticed that they had at least 30 different missing people that they had further investigated to see if by chance our skeletons were one of those victims.
They tried to track down the manufacturer of the clothing, I believe it was Brandywine Creek, I want to say, and determine where that particular dress was sold. They interviewed as many people as they could. They got trucking records. They went down every rabbit hole they could possibly go down and used every tool at their disposal that was available in the 90s, including working with other law enforcement agencies. They did everything they could to try and figure out the identity of this victim.
Investigators are nowhere in identifying their Jane Doe. Then, 1995, 1 year after she's discovered, a new potential suspect comes forward.
They had received notification from another law enforcement agency that Keith Jesperson had admitted to killing a woman along I-10 in Florida.
He was incarcerated for, I believe, Tanya Bennett's murder. And he again confesses to killing multiple other victims in different jurisdictions.
Keith Jesperson is infamous. He shamelessly confesses to 7 additional homicides after his first arrest in 1995. His nickname? The Happy Face Killer.
Mr. Jesperson was very believable to the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office. He told a story that made sense, and he gave them information that he would not otherwise have been able to get. At that point of time, we didn't have the public records that we have now, the internet, and all of the things that we have to make the kind of information, like she was found with zip ties and a floral dress, and the kind of jewelry she wore and things like that. It wasn't widely publicized. They can't do a whole lot without an identity of a victim. It's very difficult to prosecute those cases.
Keith Jesperson's confession in the Jane Doe case seems credible until he's asked to ID the victim. Other than the name Suzanne or Suzette, he now says he can't remember much else about her.
He said her name was Suzanne or Suzette. I need to know that that's a Suzanne or a Suzette in order to prosecute the case beyond a reasonable doubt. We're required to prove that there's a crime that occurred in the body of the crime, and the way the law works is you can't prove it on a confession alone.
Even with Keith Jesperson's confession, detectives are unable to move forward. Why? Because prosecutors want a definitive ID for the murder victim. So for now, not much else can be done.
96, about then, it went real cold because, in 95, he'd already confessed. And then we interviewed in 96, but then shortly thereafter, couldn't do much with it from there. I mean, the investigators tried to use whatever means they had at the time at their disposal to try and get justice, but they just were simply unsuccessful.
The murder case of Jane Doe goes cold. Can detectives trust a serial killer, Keith Jesperson, to give a truthful confession? We find out next on Bloodline Detectives. Okaloosa County, Florida, 2007. Investigators reopened the cold case of an unidentified woman discovered along Interstate 10 back in 1994. The only lead, the 1995 confession of a ruthless serial killer, Keith Jesperson. Jesperson's info about Jane Doe is sketchy, so detectives try a new strategy to ID their victim.
In 2007, this is 13 years after the body was found and a long time after this case was put on the shelf, a new approach was attempted.
They sent the skull off to a forensic anthropologist to do facial reconstruction and what they used was a clay imaging process. And that's where they place clay over certain points that are known to be of a certain thickness on the skull to recreate what the individual looked like in life.
They're interesting because it's actually a 3D rendering based off of their skull structure. They can be really accurate.
Have you seen this person? Is this person someone you knew in 1994? And at least it might be a visual trigger that would cause people to come forth with clues as to who this was.
We did get some leads from other people that were missing and family members that had reported their loved ones missing. However, those leads were followed and nothing was able to come out of it. We weren't able to identify her.
The clay mask strategy does not help identify their Jane Doe, but investigators won't give up. They send the remains off for a new round of DNA testing, hoping to create a new DNA profile they can then upload to CODIS.
CODIS is the Combined DNA Index, and that is basically the national database where people whose DNA has been taken for crimes is entered so that it can be compared to and run against crimes in which there's known DNA but not a known suspect or victim.
But we ended up sending both to FDLE, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, to their lab for genetic testing, and then ultimately also in 2007 to the FBI to do mitochondrial DNA testing. The profiles were generated, they were uploaded to CODIS, and there was nothing.
2008, investigators take a long shot at identifying Jane Doe. They send her remains off to the University of Florida for anthropological testing. The results confirm the victim's age between 35 and 55 at the time of death. Unfortunately, it still doesn't get police any closer to knowing who is Jane Doe.
We know that we have somebody that's been murdered, and because we can't identify her, one, we can't give closure to the family, and two, we can't give justice.
Okaloosa County detectives frustrated. They put the Jane Doe case back in the cold case unit. Then, 14 years later, October 2022, opportunity strikes.
I was at a national conference in Las Vegas, and I attended a talk about forensic genetic genealogy, the advances of, and how they've been successful with it.
Forensic genetic genealogy is when the DNA of a victim is compared in a database. They make sure that they have a full genome for the victim and then compare it to other genomes so that they can find relatives and identify our victims that have remained unidentified.
Othram was the company that was offering to do these kinds of identifications. And I took a picture of the slide during the conference and I sent it to my associate medical examiner, Dr. Lorraine Lopez, and I asked her, I go, can you initiate contact? Let's try to do this for Suzanne.
Othram is purpose-built to identify victims and perpetrators from crime scenes using DNA. So we have built the infrastructure necessary to be able to test the most intractable pieces of DNA evidence, the software needed to be able to build the most high-performing DNA profiles that you can upload to genealogical databases that are consented for law enforcement use to help you infer the identity of an unknown person at a crime scene.
For every case that comes to Othram, the first step for us is to understand what has been done in the past. What is the current status of the case? What items are available for testing? And so we ask for any agency to submit available information into our portal so that our scientific team can review what's available and make a decision and determination as to whether or not we believe we can work the case.
We got a call from Okaloosa Sheriff's Office, and they told us that they had unidentified remains that were found in 1994, a cold case that had absolutely no leads as to who this person might be. They did say that they thought it was a female. She was about 110 pounds when found, and she was estimated to be between the age of 35 and 55 years old.
Othram agrees to take on the case. Dr. Deanna Oleski carefully sends over part of the 28-year-old victim's remains to see if it's possible to extract a DNA sample.
We tried sending teeth at first, some molars. They were unable to extract from the molars. We did send a femur as well, and it also did not yield enough DNA for extraction. So we ended up sending part of her skull, the base of the skull, where your sphenoid sinus and your cavities live. They've had better success with that than with teeth at extracting DNA. At the end of December of 22, they were able to extract a profile from that.
We were able to do forensic-grade genome sequencing on this and create a profile that had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of SNP markers.
They had enough material to generate a profile. They used that and they compared it to persons who publicly upload their DNA to a website called GEDmatch for a comparison to see if there's any distant relatives out there that could be related to this person.
It was actually a really good profile and uploaded and led to matches in the DNA database.
We knew that there were clusters of relatives in certain parts of the United States, and that's important information. Not always are you able to immediately point to the name of a person, but rather you point to the name of relatives, and those relatives can be data sources.
It was early 2023 where we provided back the family that we thought the person belonged to, and then law enforcement made contact with her family. They asked if someone was missing. They said yes. They asked family member to provide DNA so that we could confirm the result.
The victim's mother. They performed a buccal swab for YSTR testing to compare that to our victim and determine that it was indeed the child of the person whose DNA they had taken a buccal swab of.
The buccal swab test returns a positive result. That means Othram successfully finds the mother of Jane Doe.
I told my colleagues that we're going to identify her before the end of the year. We were able to identify her within 2 months. I was in my office and Dr. Lopez yelled at me down the hallway and said, "We identified Suzanne." I go, "Oh, what's her name?" And she goes, "Suzanne." I go, "Are you kidding me?" The whole time that was actually her name. It felt really, really good. It was pure and utter excitement. We kind of bounced around for a couple minutes cheering that we actually had her name for once, and it was incredible.
Detectives are finally able to put a name to the remains. It's Suzanne Schellenberg. She was 34 years old at the time that she was killed.
We knew that she was from the Midwest, that her father was an attorney, that she had a brother, that her family had not given up on looking for her for a long time.
Back then it was, wait 24 hours or 48 hours, see if they're doing their own thing or if it's a child, if they maybe went to a friend's house and just didn't tell their parents. Not taken as serious, I guess, as it is now. I mean, now we immediately do a missing persons report based on the situation. It can even be an endangered to where it gets pushed out quicker. But back then it seemed like it was kind of well, let's wait and see if they come back first.
But she was 34 years old, in her mid-30s, and she liked to roam around. She was something of a free spirit in that way, in that she would spend time in this part of the country and then in another part of the country.
She was kind of a drifter. She would kind of just do her own thing. She would get rides, which was not uncommon at that time, to get a ride with a truck driver or hitchhike with somebody. She wasn't necessarily stayed in contact with her family. She just kind of did her own thing. There was a lot of communication between my office as well as the medical examiner's office and the state attorney's office because, Keith Jesperson had previously confessed to killing Suzanne. He's already serving several life sentences for other murders and has been convicted of. So there was a little bit of, well, are we going to move forward with this when he's already serving life sentences? And the ultimate decision was, yes, Suzanne, as well as her family, deserved the same justice as the other victims from Keith Jesperson. So at that point, it was decided to make a trip to Oregon to do a face-to-face interview with Jesperson.
Science and great police work joined forces to finally identify Jane Doe. Now, investigators want to know why she died and who murdered her. That's next on Bloodline Detectives. Okaloosa County, Florida, 2023, 29 years after the remains of a woman found dumped along the side of Interstate 10. Detectives finally know who she is. Her name, Suzanne Schellenberg, 34 years old at the time of her murder. But now, detectives want to question infamous serial killer Keith Jesperson. In 1995, Jesperson confesses he sex assaults and murders Suzanne Schellenberg.
Keith Jesperson is a very proud serial killer. If you add up all of the stories of the people he claims to have killed, it would be about 160. However, law enforcement and prosecutors, while they might like to pin all those killings on one person, close all these cases, they tend to want to have some evidence to go along with it. And if they think that he's just boasting about this and not bringing the information to connect him to the killing, He doesn't. They have been able to verify 8.
Since 1990, Keith Jesperson is known as the Happy Face Killer. Why? Because of confession letters he writes to law enforcement and media.
Mr. Jesperson wrote several letters to the press and he signed them with happy faces.
He had written little notes on bathroom stalls at truck stops, signed again with the happy face, the smiley face, almost taunting the police and media, letting them know that the person that's responsible for these deaths are him and he's still out there.
Detectives now go to the Oregon State Prison to interview serial killer Keith Jesperson. They want to know if he really murdered Suzanne Schellenberg or if his confession all those years ago is a lie.
Mr. Jesperson was in the Oregon Penitentiary located in Salem, Oregon.
So in September of 2023, we did elect to go do a face-to-face unannounced. So Keith Jesperson did not realize that we were going to be coming to talk to him. And it was a team of 4. It was myself, my partner, Investigator Pittman, FDLE Special Agent Mark Zager, and then our Assistant State Attorney who was going to be trying the case, which was Michelle Sandler.
We look at several different scenarios that could happen before we go there, and we review the case file heavily so that we can gauge his truthfulness. The fact that we had a confession from 1996 was incredibly helpful because then we had something that we could compare to the evidence and to whatever statement he gave in 2023 to see how truthful he was being. We needed him to answer time and place and detail more than anything else. We needed to make sure that he knew things only the killer would know. We were a little worried he might feign ignorance or refuse to speak with us.
Once we got there and we introduced ourselves, Keith Jesperson knew exactly why we were there. When we walked in and I said that we were from Florida, he said, "Oh, about the girl I killed in Holt." He knew exactly. This is a big man. He obviously had put on some weight since the 1990s, photos, but he's probably about 6'5", probably pushing 300 pounds, and he had huge hands. He is older now, so he had gray hair and glasses, but a very big guy.
He was a very affable, friendly guy to meet us. If you didn't know he was a serial killer, you would think he was a typical big gregarious type of fellow, but knowing he was a serial killer kept us guarded.
Okaloosa County, Florida detectives interrogating a serial killer. Can they confirm he savagely murdered a defenseless woman 29 years before? We find out next on Bloodline Detectives. Florida detectives are at the Oregon State Penitentiary to interview notorious serial killer Keith Jesperson. In 1995, he confesses to the brutal sex assault and murder of Suzanne Schellenberg, the 34-year-old dumped along Interstate 10. She's not identified for 28 years, and now detectives are determined to close her murder case and seal his confession.
We needed to be very careful that any conviction that we got had integrity, meaning that it would not be overturned. So we wanted to make sure that he had representation, that he was able to review the evidence with his attorney and decide to plea freely and voluntarily of his own free will.
I just asked him to just tell me what happened. I kind of let him just talk and explain everything, and then if we needed to clarify something, we would, but I explained to him that I had done all this research and I kind of just wanted to hear it from his own mouth.
He was outstanding out there at the truck stop. And I parked in her next to the restaurant. And I just walked out to her and I said, "Where you headed?" She was headed to Lake Tahoe, Nevada.
Yeah, do you know, did she have ties there? Did she say anything about that?
All I know is that's where she said she was headed. And I told her, I said, "I'm not going to Nevada. However, I don't even know where I'm headed. I've got to pick up a load, and I don't even know what load I was going to pick up. But when I do, I'm headed to Washington State. So I'll be in the area. I could take you so far. So we headed up. We got up to Unical 76 truck stop about 80 miles north. And I fueled up there, went in, and I got a shower for her and myself. We didn't shower the same shower. We showered separately. I told her meet me in the restaurant, and we'll have something to eat before we head north. And so she sits down and she ordered all-you-can-eat spaghetti, and she was on her second plate. We need to get going, right? So she gets in the truck, we take off. Now I backtrack about, I don't know, 20 miles maybe, and drop down into Florida.
Okay.
So we can get on Interstate 10.
Yes, sir.
And we're heading west on Interstate 10, and at exit 18 is a rest area, and I park in right behind the security there.
She was sleeping and he decided, well, you know, I'm not supposed to have unauthorized riders here, so let me go make sure I don't get in trouble. He claims that she was asleep and that he was trying to be a gentleman and wake her up to see if she needed to use the restroom. And when she woke up, he thinks he startled her, but she started screaming, and he knew that that security officer was right next to him and he didn't want to get in trouble.
And then she started screaming. She just sat up and started screaming. I was like, shut up. The more I told her to shut up, the more she screamed.
Okay.
And I don't need that because I wasn't supposed to have people in my truck anyway, non-authorized and all that, so I just killed her. You got to consider after murdering too many people, that it was just an easy thing to do. And I was fearful because she ate all that spaghetti and stuff that she would, you know, when I moved her, that maybe it'd come up. I wasn't quite sure, but I took 2 plastic ties that I had and put around her neck and secured, figured that when I moved her that nothing would come out. That's why I did that. Yeah, I pulled on out. I went down to exit 11. And it's a university exit, I believe. I think that was on one of the signs.
Okay.
I pulled down and crossed the road and came up on the other side and pulled up as far as the wide shoulder was, parked, and I walked over to, which would be the north side, walked to the north. And there's a tree row there, and then on the other side of the tree row was a fence. And I knew, so I figured I'd put her in the tree row.
It was chilling to hear somebody so casually discuss the murder of another human being. When I heard the story, I felt like it was a person who had very little regard for human life.
No remorse. You know, it was matter of fact. It was just so matter of fact. He enjoyed talking about it. You know, it's kind of the sense that I got from it. He liked that attention.
We were with him for a couple hours, and then we left and came home quickly. And then we decided to file on the case as second-degree murder, and that's just because the state of Florida requires that if you file first-degree murder, you have to convene a grand jury. And we knew he was already willing to plead a life.
Keith Jesperson convicted for the second-degree murder of Suzanne Schellenberg on April 4, 2024.
I was happy to have the case closed to have justice for Suzanne Schellenberg.
We contacted the family and they had to make arrangements for her remains, which once we had gathered and gotten back from Othram, and we made sure that we had all of her back. They contacted a funeral home, and we released her remains to a funeral home, and I believe she was cremated.
I can't imagine losing someone that I care about and not having any answers. And I think that there's nothing more devastating than allowing a serial perpetrator to conceal the identity of someone and take away their voice forever. They leave them voiceless. To me, that's horrible. And so it means a lot to me to be able to say that I think this technology is going to lead to a world where no one is ever left voiceless like that.
It certainly motivated me to make sure I never give up on a case. just because we don't have something right in front of our eyes doesn't mean we can't develop something, and it grounded me to know to keep working on these cases, because somewhere out there's a family member that is wondering where their loved one is or deserves that justice. And I have cold cases all the way back from 73, so it's given me hope to try to move forward on those and get justice to where we're able to solve all of our cold cases.
Incredible work of law enforcement and scientists finally solve the brutal sex attack and tragic murder of Suzanne Schellenberg. Their combined efforts prove justice can prevail in even the toughest homicide cases after 30 long years. I'm Nancy Grace. Thank you for joining us here on Bloodline Detectives.